September 17th, 1978. 7:23 a.m. Alexandria, Virginia. The morning commute on Route 1 moved with its usual sluggish rhythm. Brake lights flickered red in the humid dawn. The air smelled of diesel and cut grass. Robert Hansen, a 27-year-old Federal Bureau of Investigation counterintelligence analyst, sat in his Ford Fairmont. His briefcase rested on the passenger seat beside a thermos of coffee his wife packed. The briefcase was burgundy leather. It was scuffed at the corners with brass clasps that clicked with a satisfying metallic snap. He had bought it at a Hecht's department store sale 6 months earlier. Inside were classified documents about Soviet diplomatic personnel in Washington, a brown bag lunch, and a copy of The Screw-Tape Letters he read during his lunch breaks. Hansen did not notice the Dodge sedan 2 vehicles behind him. He did not register that the same car had been parked across from his apartment complex on 4 separate mornings this month. The driver, a man later identified only as Subject Amber in Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance logs, wore aviator sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He watched Hansen's Fairmont with the practiced patience of someone trained at the KGB's second chief directorate school in Moscow. But this September morning, neither man knew their proximity to each other. Neither understood that they lived within a 2-mile radius of one of the most sensitive military installations in the Western Hemisphere. Neither had yet made the mistake that would unravel everything. The traffic light changed. The Fairmont accelerated toward the Pentagon. The Dodge sedan followed, maintaining exactly 3 car lengths of distance. In a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia, a filing cabinet contained a manila folder. It was marked Unresolved Alexandria Penetration. Inside were 8 months of surveillance photographs, intercepted radio signals, and a single piece of physical evidence that did not make sense yet. This was a receipt from the Hot Shoppe restaurant on Duke Street. The timestamp on the receipt was 6:47 in the evening. The date was March 3, 1978. The total was $1.85. It was for 2 coffees, black. The receipt was found folded inside a rolled newspaper in a trash can at Fort Ward Park. The newspaper was Izvestia, 3 weeks old, Moscow edition. The temperature that morning was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. By afternoon, it would climb to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Someone's career would end before sunset. The official story appeared in the Washington Post's Metro section 3 years later. It was a 6-paragraph article buried on page B9. It described the event as a routine counterintelligence success. The piece read, "Federal authorities arrested a foreign national on charges of espionage yesterday after an 18-month investigation." The article continued, "The suspect, whose name has not been released pending diplomatic negotiations, allegedly maintained a residence in Northern Virginia while engaged in intelligence collection activities." The article mentioned no specifics about methods, no details about what was compromised, and no names of the investigators who broke the case. The Soviet embassy issued a terse denial. The story disappeared from the news cycle within 48 hours. Both superpowers believed in 1978 that the other side had achieved perfect infiltration. This belief shaped their assumptions and their paranoia. The Central Intelligence Agency operated under the premise that the KGB had successfully placed illegal agents throughout the Washington metropolitan area. These were deep-cover operatives with manufactured American identities. These were not diplomats with immunity or known intelligence officers working under official cover. These were ghosts. They were people with social security numbers, driver's licenses, employment histories, and tax returns. They spoke English without accent. They understood baseball scores. They complained about property taxes and belonged to Rotary clubs. The KGB, reciprocally, assumed the Central Intelligence Agency had done the same in Moscow. The paranoia was symmetrical and self-reinforcing. The stakes in 1978 were not the apocalyptic brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were also not the ideological showdown of Berlin. This was the era of détente's slow collapse. Strategic arms limitation treaties were being cheated on by both sides. There was the neutron bomb debate and Soviet expansion in Africa. The intelligence war had become granular and technical. What mattered now was not the dramatic defection or the satellite photograph of missile sites. Instead, it was the steady hemorrhage of technical specifications, deployment schedules, cipher materials, and personnel rosters. This was death by 1,000 paper cuts. The intelligence services had learned that the most valuable intelligence came from the margins. This was not from recruiting high-level officials. Those officials were watched constantly and subjected to polygraphs and background investigations. Instead, intelligence came from people like a secretary with access to travel schedules. It also came from a maintenance contractor who serviced secure communications equipment. Or it could be a low-level analyst who processed raw intercepts and could identify patterns over time. These people were invisible. They lived in suburbs. They carpooled. In Alexandria, Virginia, in 1978, approximately 14,000 people with security clearances lived within a 15-minute drive of the Pentagon. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division operated out of cramped offices. These offices were in the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue. The division chief, a man named Warren Matthews, had joined the Bureau in 1957. This was after a brief career as a Navy cryptologist. He understood technical intelligence in a way many Federal Bureau of Investigation agents did not. Matthews had spent the early 1970s studying KGB communications methodology. He learned how Moscow Center coordinated its networks in the United States. He knew that by 1978, the Soviets had largely abandoned classic dead-drop techniques. These techniques included hollowed-out coins and carved-out bolts in park railings that had characterized the 1950s and 1960s. The new methodology was subtler. It involved short-range radio bursts, encrypted personal advertisements in newspapers, and occasionally brief physical meetings disguised as chance encounters in public places. The Hot Shoppe on Duke Street, where that coffee receipt originated, was a 24-hour diner. It was frequented by shift workers from the nearby rail yard, nurses from Alexandria Hospital, and Pentagon employees. They would grab breakfast on their way to work. It was anonymous. The waitresses turned over every 6 months. Nobody paid attention to who sat in which booth. It was, in the clinical language of the KGB's operational manual, suitable for brief contact in commercial environment with natural cover for action. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been watching the Hot Shoppe sporadically since 1976. This was after a GRU defector in Vienna mentioned that Alexandria had been described in a training lecture as favorable operational terrain. However, watching a diner is resource-intensive. It produces mostly worthless surveillance. This included footage of tired commuters eating eggs, not espionage. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not from human surveillance. It came from something far more mundane: trash analysis. Fort Ward Park was a 70-acre wooded area in western Alexandria. It had once been a Union Army fort during the Civil War. By 1978, it was a neighborhood park with jogging trails, a small museum, and 3 trash receptacles. City sanitation workers emptied these receptacles every Tuesday and Friday. In March 1978, one of those sanitation workers was a Federal Bureau of Investigation informant. His name was Dennis Cole. He had been paid $200 per month since 1974. His task was to report anything unusual he found during his rounds. Unusual meant documents in foreign languages, large quantities of the same newspaper, burnt paper, photographic equipment, or any item that looked deliberately placed rather than discarded. On March 3, 1978, Cole found a rolled copy of Izvestia in the trash can nearest the parking lot. Inside the rolled newspaper was a receipt from the Hot Shoppe. The receipt itself was meaningless in isolation, except for one detail. It had been deliberately folded into a precise rectangle with 3 creased edges. It was placed in the exact center of the rolled newspaper. That level of care indicated purpose. Cole reported the find. The receipt was logged into evidence. A Federal Bureau of Investigation analyst noted the timestamp, 6:47 in the evening. This was cross-referenced with the diner's shift schedule. March 3 was a Friday. The 6 to 7 in the evening hour would have been the tail end of the dinner rush. It would be busy, but not chaotic. 2 black coffees suggested a meeting between 2 people who did not intend to stay long. The analyst filed the report. It sat in a drawer for 2 months. What nobody understood yet was that this receipt was not a message or a signal. It was a mistake. Someone's pocket had been too full. Someone had grabbed the wrong newspaper. Someone had failed to properly dispose of evidence, and that failure would cascade. Behind the suburban facade of Alexandria, 2 parallel operations were unfolding in the spring of 1978. Neither was aware of the other's existence. This was beneath the routines of morning carpools and evening Little League games. The first operation was codenamed Distant Thunder by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It had begun in November 1977. This was after Signal's intelligence analysts at Fort Meade detected anomalous radio transmissions. These transmissions emanated from somewhere in Northern Virginia. The transmissions were brief, never longer than 8 seconds. They occurred irregularly, sometimes twice in 1 week, sometimes not for a month. The signals were encrypted using a one-time pad system. This made them effectively unbreakable without the corresponding pad. However, the National Security Agency could analyze the transmission characteristics. These included frequency, power output, and antenna polarization. The signals were consistent with a portable radio transmitter, probably suitcase-sized. It was operating from a residential area. Direction-finding analysis narrowed the source to a roughly 3-square-mile area of Alexandria. This area was between Beauregard Street and Duke Street. It had approximately 8,000 residents. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began quiet inquiries. Who had moved into the area recently? Who had unusual work hours? Who paid rent in cash? Who had no verifiable employment history beyond 2 years? The investigation moved with bureaucratic slowness. Agents knocked on doors with cover stories. These stories were about checking voter registration records or conducting census verification. They compiled lists. They cross-referenced these with Internal Revenue Service filings. They watched parking patterns and noted which cars left early and returned late. What they did not know was that the Soviet illegal they were hunting had been in place since 1972. They could not have known this. His name, the one he used in Alexandria, was David Barnett. He was 41 years old. However, the birth certificate that established his identity listed his age as 43. He worked as a technical writer for a defense contractor called Electronic Data Systems. This job did not require a security clearance. However, it placed him in proximity to people who had them. He lived in a garden apartment complex called The Fountains. This was a sprawling development of 3-story buildings. They were arranged around a central courtyard with a non-functional fountain. The fountain had been dry since 1975. His apartment was number 247. It was a second-floor corner unit with a balcony facing the parking lot. David Barnett's backstory, the legend constructed for him by the KGB's Department S, was simple and deliberately boring. He was born in Cleveland in 1935. His father worked in a steel mill and died in 1958. His mother moved to Florida and died in 1969. He had no siblings. He was drafted in 1956 and served 2 years in the Army. He was a clerk at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and received an honorable discharge. He worked various jobs in technical publishing in Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit. He finally moved to Washington in 1972. He never married. He had no children. He had no criminal record. He had no foreign travel except for a 2-week trip to Mexico in 1968. The legend was good because it was unmemorable. Nobody looked twice at David Barnett. His neighbours knew him as quiet but friendly. He attended the apartment complex's annual barbecue. He shoveled snow from the sidewalk in front of his building. He drove a 3-year-old Chevrolet Nova. It was brown, with a dent in the rear bumper that he never bothered to fix. His apartment contained furniture from Sears. He had a television that received 4 channels. A shelf of paperback thrillers and a small ham radio setup completed the decor. He explained the radio setup to the apartment manager as a hobby left over from his army days. The ham radio setup was real. What the apartment manager could not see was the secondary transmitter. This device was hidden inside the hollowed-out base of the radio. It was the size of a cigarette pack. It was capable of transmitting encrypted burst communications to a Soviet receiver. This receiver operated from the embassy's secure floor. David Barnett's assignment was not glamorous. He was not stealing classified documents or recruiting assets. His job was simply listening. His social circle included 3 engineers. These engineers worked on guidance systems for the Pershing II missile. He also knew 2 Pentagon logistics officers he had met through a bowling league. Finally, there was a secretary at the Defense Intelligence Agency. He had struck up a conversation with her at a Safeway. He asked casual questions. He would ask, "What are you working on?" Or, "How is the project going?" Another question was, "Is the new computer system making things easier or harder?" He remembered everything. Once a month, he typed up reports on onion skin paper. He then photographed them with a Minox camera. The film cartridges went into dead drops in Rock Creek Park. The KGB considered him a productive and reliable source. His intelligence was not flashy. There were no documents stamped top secret. He also provided no diagrams of weapons systems. However, he provided context, timelines, office politics, and personnel changes. He helped Moscow understand the texture of American defense planning. Satellite photography could not provide this level of detail. He had been invisible for 6 years. The second operation had no code name. This was because it was not officially an operation yet. It was being run by a single Federal Bureau of Investigation analyst named Margaret Vickers. She was 33 years old. She was a graduate of Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She was fluent in Russian and German. She was assigned to the Counterintelligence Division's research section. Her job was to read. She read Soviet newspapers and journals. She looked for patterns in personnel announcements and obituaries. These patterns might indicate intelligence officers being rotated home. She read defector debriefings. She also read transcripts of diplomatic cocktail parties. She compiled many notes. In April 1978, Vickers was reviewing surveillance reports from the previous 6 months. She was looking for anomalies. She noticed a Hot Shoppe receipt and an Izvestia newspaper from Fort Ward Park. She noticed that Fort Ward Park was 1.3 miles from the last known location of the anomalous radio transmissions. She also noticed that the receipt was dated March 3. A radio transmission had been detected on March 4. She pulled the file on every resident of Alexandria who matched a basic profile. This profile included males living alone. They arrived in the area between 1970 and 1975. They were employed, but not in a way that generated extensive records. The list had 43 names. One name stood out. It was not because of anything dramatic. Instead, it was because of something absent. David Barnett had no footprint before 1972. His Social Security number had been issued in 1956. However, no tax returns were filed under that number until 1972. His army service was documented. But attempts to contact anyone who had served with him at Fort Leonard Wood came up empty. His employment history checked out on paper. However, nobody at his supposed previous employers in Cleveland or Chicago remembered him. Vickers requested physical surveillance. Warren Matthews, her division chief, authorized 3 agents for a 2-week rotation. On May 12, 1978, surveillance began on David Barnett, the agents noted. His routine. He departed for work at 7:45 ante-meridian. He returned at 6:15 post-meridian. He rarely went out in the evenings except for groceries or an occasional movie. He bowled on Thursday nights. He attended a Lutheran church on Sunday mornings. He stopped at the Hot Shoppe for coffee approximately once a week. He always sat at the counter, always alone. This routine changed on June 2, 1978. That Friday, David Barnett entered the Hot Shoppe at 6:33 post-meridian. He sat in a booth. At 6:41 post-meridian, another man entered. He approached the counter as if to order. Then he appeared to change his mind and sat in the same booth. The 2 men talked for 11 minutes. They drank coffee. At 6:52 post-meridian, both men stood. They shook hands briefly. The second man left first. Barnett paid at the counter. He left a receipt on the table. The Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance team photographed both men. They followed the second man to a car in the parking lot. It was a Ford Limited with diplomatic plates, registered to the Soviet embassy. The driver was Viktor Cherkashin. He was identified in Federal Bureau of Investigation files as a known KGB officer. Cherkashin was operating undercover as a cultural attaché. The pieces assembled themselves. The radio transmissions, the newspaper in the park, the receipt, the meeting at the Hot Shoppe. David Barnett was not a low-level source passing gossip. He was an illegal. Cherkashin had broken protocol by meeting him directly. Margaret Vickers understood immediately what this meant. Moscow was desperate for whatever Barnett was providing, desperate enough to risk exposing him. The decision to move fast or wait is the eternal dilemma of counterintelligence work. If you arrest too early, you lose the chance to identify the full network. If you wait too long, the target disappears or the damage multiplies. Warren Matthews convened a crisis meeting in his office on June 5, 1978. Present were Margaret Vickers, 3 senior counterintelligence agents, and a Justice Department attorney. This attorney was named Paul Hendricks. He would have to sign off on any arrest warrant. Matthews laid out the evidence. He presented the surveillance photos. He showed the radio intercepts. He explained the background gaps in Barnett's identity. Finally, he described the meeting with Cherkashin. Hendricks, a cautious man, had spent 15 years prosecuting espionage cases. He asked the essential question, "What can you prove in court?" The answer was, "Not enough." Meeting with a Soviet diplomat was not a crime. Operating a ham radio was not a crime. Having an inconsistent employment history was not a crime. The radio transmissions were encrypted, so there was no proof of content. The photograph of Barnett and Cherkashin showed a conversation, not an exchange of materials. A defense attorney would shred the circumstantial connections. Vickers proposed an alternative. She said, "We search his apartment. We get a warrant based on the totality of the evidence. Then we find the radio transmitter. That is physical proof." Matthews shook his head. He asked, And if he has disposed of it? What if it is in a storage locker or buried in the woods? Then we have shown our hand and gained nothing. The discussion circled for 2 hours. Finally, Hendricks suggested a third option. He said, run a false flag operation. Create a scenario that forces him to make contact with his handlers in a way we can document. The plan they devised was elegant in its simplicity. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would stage a security scare at Electronic Data Systems, Barnett's employer. A memo would circulate, marked confidential. It would state that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was conducting a routine background investigation of all employees. This was due to the company's new contract involving classified work. Employees would be interviewed individually. The goal was to panic Barnett into believing he was under suspicion. This would trigger emergency contact protocols with Moscow. The risk was that Barnett might recognize the trap and vanish. Illegals were trained to have escape plans. These included forged passports, cash reserves, and exfiltration routes. But Matthews gambled that Barnett, after 6 years of comfortable routine, had grown complacent. On June 19, 1978, the false memo circulated at Electronic Data Systems. On June 20, David Barnett called in sick. Surveillance tracked him leaving his apartment at 10:23 ante-meridian. He drove not to a pharmacy or doctor's office, but to Fort Ward Park. He parked in the same lot where the trash can with the Izvestia newspaper had been found. He walked the jogging trail for 15 minutes, carrying his burgundy briefcase. It was the same model Robert Hansen carried, though neither man would ever meet. At 10:47, ante-meridian, Barnett stopped at a park bench. He opened the briefcase. He removed a newspaper, not Izvestia this time, but the Washington Post. He placed it on the bench beside him. He sat for 3 minutes. Then he stood, picked up the briefcase, and walked back to his car. The newspaper remained on the bench. Surveillance photographed everything from a van parked 200 yards away. At 11:04 ante-meridian, a jogger approached the bench. He sat briefly, picked up the newspaper, and continued running. The jogger was later identified as Anatoly Kureyev. He was a third secretary at the Soviet embassy. He had no previous Federal Bureau of Investigation file indicating intelligence connections. The Federal Bureau of Investigation waited until Kureyev left the park. Then they moved in and arrested David Barnett in the parking lot. Inside the briefcase were a Minox camera, 3 exposed film cartridges, and a handwritten note on onion skin paper. It read in English, "Security inquiry at work. Possible compromise. Request exfiltration. Protocol activation." Inside his apartment, discovered during the search executed simultaneously with the arrest, were several items. There was the modified radio transmitter. There was a one-time pad hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Gulag Archipelago. There was $8,000 in cash. Finally, there was a West German passport in the name of Klaus Meyer. In a shoebox on the top shelf of his bedroom closet were 17 receipts from the Hot Shoppe. Each was folded into a precise rectangle. Each corresponded to dates when radio transmissions had been detected. Barnett had kept them as a personal record. It was a way of tracking his meetings. It was a violation of every security protocol he had been taught. But humans, even trained intelligence officers, have weaknesses. His was a need for order, for documentation, for proof of his own existence. The coffee receipts, meaningless individually, became in aggregate a perfect record of his espionage. The interrogation of David Barnett lasted 11 days. He was held at a secure facility in Quantico, Virginia. It was a nondescript building officially designated as a training annex. However, it was equipped with soundproofed interview rooms and holding cells. These met Justice Department standards for pretrial detention. Margaret Vickers, led the interrogation. She was supported by 2 Central Intelligence Agency officers. They had flown in from Langley specifically for this case. The agency wanted to know how much damage had been done. They also wanted to know what Barnett had reported. Finally, they wanted to know who else in his network might still be operational. Barnett said nothing for the first 48 hours. He sat in the interview room with his hands folded on the table. He occasionally sipped water. He refused to acknowledge questions. Vickers recognized the tactic. Moscow Center trained its illegals to stay silent through the initial shock of arrest. They were trained to wait and assess what the interrogators actually knew. Only then would they decide whether to cooperate or fabricate. On the 3rd day, Vickers changed her approach. She entered the interview room alone. She was without the Central Intelligence Agency officers and without recording equipment. She sat across from Barnett and said, "Your real name is Nikolai Stashinsky. You were recruited by the 2nd Chief Directorate in 1968. This was after you failed the entrance exam for the Foreign Ministry. Your mother is still alive. She lives in Leningrad in a communal apartment on Nevsky Prospect. Moscow has not told her you have been arrested. They will not, because admitting you exist would mean admitting this operation existed." None of this was true. Vickers had no idea who Barnett really was. However, the specificity of the false information and the intimate details created the impression of comprehensive knowledge. Barnett's expression shifted. Not dramatically. A trained operative controls his reactions. But it was enough. There was a tightening around his eyes. He paused before reaching for the water glass. He asked for a lawyer. Vickers told him he would get one. However, she explained that lawyers could not negotiate what she could offer. The Soviet authorities had already written him off. The embassy would disavow any knowledge of his activities. He would be convicted on their evidence. He would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. Alternatively, he could cooperate. A full debriefing was required. They would recommend a reduced sentence of 15 years instead of life imprisonment. He would be 60 when released. This was old, but it was not dead. Barnett stared at the table. He then insisted on having a lawyer first. The negotiation took 4 more days. Barnett's attorney, a public defender named Thomas Cranston, who had been assigned the case, reviewed the evidence. He delivered a bleak assessment. The government had him. The meeting in the park was admissible. The briefcase contents were admissible. The apartment search was also admissible. A jury would convict him in under 2 hours. On June 27, 1978, Barnett agreed to cooperate. What emerged over the next week was a portrait of an intelligence operation. This was documented in 180 pages of debriefing transcripts. The operation had been meticulously planned. It was flawlessly executed until a single moment of carelessness. Barnett's real name was Andrei Volkov, pronounced Andrei Volkov. He was born in Leningrad, pronounced Leningrad, in 1937. He was not born in Cleveland, pronounced Cleveland, in 1935. His father had been a naval engineer, not a steel worker. Volkov had been recruited by the KGB, pronounced KGB, in 1970. This occurred after working as a translator for Soviet delegations visiting East Germany, pronounced East Germany. The KGB saw potential in him. He spoke fluent English with a slight Midwestern accent. This accent was learned from Voice of America, pronounced Voice of Achmer Aikur, broadcasts. He was unmarried with no close family ties. Furthermore, he possessed the temperament for long-term solitary work. His training lasted 18 months. The KGB's Department S, pronounced Department ESS, responsible for illegals, put him through language refinement. This training also included American cultural immersion, counter-surveillance techniques, and tradecraft. He memorized the layout of Cleveland neighborhoods he had supposedly grown up in. He learned to drive with American habits. These included signaling turns, stopping fully at stop signs, and maintaining speed limits. He studied baseball statistics and television shows. He learned to complain about taxes and weather with the rhythms of American casual conversation. In November 1971, Volkov entered the United States through the Canadian border at Buffalo, pronounced Buff-a-lo, New York. He used a genuine United States passport issued under the name David Barnett. The passport was authentic because the identity was authentic, or it had been. The real David Barnett had died in a car accident in Detroit, pronounced Detroit, in 1970. He was age 35, unmarried, with no children. The KGB had obtained his birth certificate through a network of document forgers. They applied for the passport through standard channels. The State Department, pronounced State Department, had no reason to check death records. It issued the passport. Volkov, also known as Barnett, spent 6 months in Chicago, pronounced Chicago, establishing his legend. This involved renting an apartment, opening a bank account, and filing a tax return. Then he moved to Washington, pronounced Washington, and became invisible. According to his debriefing, his intelligence production included several key areas. These included detailed descriptions of Defense Department, pronounced Defense Department, contracting procedures. He also provided personality profiles of 63 military and civilian personnel. These individuals had access to missile development programs. He further reported timelines for the Pershing II, pronounced Pershing II, deployment schedule. Assessments of morale and technical problems in 3 different weapons projects were also included. Nothing he reported was classified in itself. However, when assembled, this intelligence gave Moscow, pronounced Mohesko, a comprehensive picture of American military modernization programs. The CIA, pronounced CIA, officers conducting the damage assessment were most interested in one specific question. That question was who Volkov had compromised by name. Had he identified American intelligence officers or Soviet sources working for the United States? Volkov's answer was no. His assignment had been technical intelligence collection, not counterintelligence. He had never been told to look for American spies. Furthermore, he was not instructed to report on his contacts' access to classified information. This would have exposed them as intelligence targets. This answer was both reassuring and frustrating. There were no burned sources. However, there were also no leads to other Soviet operations. Vickers asked a final question about the receipts. She asked why he had kept them. Volkov hesitated. He then explained that he wanted to remember. He said it was 6 years of living a fake life. It was 6 years of pretending. The receipts were proof that he was real. They were proof that he had done something that mattered. It was the most human thing he said during the entire interrogation. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once Volkov agreed to plead guilty. On September 8, 1978, in Federal District Court in Alexandria, pronounced Alexandria, he stood before Judge Harrison Winter, pronounced Harrison Winter. He admitted to 1 count of espionage. The plea agreement was negotiated by the Justice Department, pronounced Justice Department. It was approved by a closed hearing before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, pronounced Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The plea agreement sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. This was a reduced sentence. The espionage statute allowed for a life term. This reduction reflected his cooperation. It also reflected the government's assessment that his intelligence production, while damaging, had not directly led to deaths or the compromise of specific operations. The Soviet Union's response was predictable. It was denial. The official news agency, TASS, pronounced TAS, ran a 2-paragraph story. It described the arrest as a provocation by United States security services. The article claimed this was an attempt to poison Soviet-American relations. The Soviet embassy in Washington issued no statement. Viktor Cherkashin, pronounced Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB officer photographed meeting Volkov at the Hot Shoppe, pronounced Hot Shoppe, was quietly recalled to Moscow. He never returned to the United States. Within the intelligence community, the case generated intense interest. This was not for what Volkov had accomplished, but for how long he had remained undetected. The CIA commissioned an internal study. It was completed in November 1978. This study was classified top secret until its partial declassification in 2003. It examined what the agency termed the illegal penetration threat in the National Capital Region, pronounced Nash-un-ul Kapital, Region. The study estimated that between 5 and 12 Soviet illegals might be operating in the Washington area at any given time. The FBI, pronounced FBI, increased its counterintelligence resources. It expanded physical and electronic surveillance. Margaret Vickers, pronounced Margaret Vickers, became, briefly, the Bureau's most celebrated analyst. She received the FBI Director's Award for Distinguished Service, pronounced FBI Director's Award for Distinguished Service, in a private ceremony in January 1979. Her career trajectory shifted. She was promoted to supervisory analyst. She was then assigned to manage the FBI's illegal identification program. This was a new initiative focused on detecting false identities. However, the most significant revelation came not from Volkov's debriefing, but from a subsequent investigation. Vickers launched this investigation based on something he had mentioned in passing. During one interrogation session, Volkov had referred to his training in Moscow. He described the apartment where Department S instructors had worked with him on his American accent and cultural knowledge. He described the location as a building on Leninsky Prospect, pronounced Leninsky Prospekt, on the 3rd floor. It had a green door at the end of the hallway. Vickers passed this information to CIA counterintelligence. In February 1979, a CIA source in Moscow, whose identity remains classified, confirmed the building's existence. The source photographed several of its visitors over a 3-month period. 2 of the photographed individuals were later identified entering the United States through JFK Airport, pronounced JFK Airport, in New York. They used what appeared to be genuine United States passports. The FBI opened investigations on both. One was arrested in San Diego, pronounced San Diego, in 1981. He was working as a computer technician at a defense contractor. The other vanished in 1980 and has never been found. The investigation remains open. The damage assessment for Volkov's 6-year operation concluded that his reporting had accelerated Soviet understanding of United States missile programs by approximately 8 to 12 months. The Pershing II deployment timeline, which Volkov had reported with precision, allowed Soviet military planners to adjust their own intermediate-range missile programs. The intelligence was not catastrophic, but it was not negligible. 3 careers ended because of Volkov's operation. A Defense Department security director resigned. An internal investigation found that his office had failed to properly vet employee backgrounds. This occurred when electronic data systems, pronounced electronic data systems, began handling sensitive contracts. A CIA counterintelligence officer took early retirement. It was revealed that his division had possessed fragments of information about Soviet illegal activity in Alexandria since 1976. However, his division had not connected these pieces of information. Warren Matthews, pronounced Warren Matthews, an FBI division chief, had authorized the operation to arrest Volkov. He was transferred to a training position in Atlanta, pronounced At-Lan 2. Justice Department officials criticized his decision. They believed he ran a false flag operation without higher approval. Only Vickers emerged strengthened. She continued working counterintelligence cases until her retirement in 1994. In a 2007 interview for an FBI oral history project, she reflected on the Volkov case. She noted that people do not understand that most espionage is not dramatic. It does not involve car chases and shootouts. Instead, it involves receipts, trash cans, and boring surveillance reports. She emphasized that success comes from being more patient and meticulous than the other side. Volkov was patient for 6 years. They were patient for 8 months. That, she stated, was the difference. Andrei Volkov served his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Marion, pronounced Marion, Illinois, pronounced Illinois. This was a maximum security facility that housed at various times several other convicted spies. He was a model prisoner. He worked in the prison library. He taught English to other inmates. He wrote occasional letters to his elderly mother in Leningrad. The Soviet authorities allowed these to be delivered after heavy censorship. In 1985, he was approached by FBI counterintelligence officers. They were seeking information about other potential KGB illegals. However, he declined to provide additional cooperation beyond his original debriefing. He told the officers that he had said what he knew. He added that he would not invent things to reduce his sentence. In 1988, as United States-Soviet relations thawed under Gorbachev's, pronounced Gorbachev, reforms, Volkov was included in a prisoner exchange. This was negotiated through Swiss, pronounced Swiss, intermediaries. He was released to Soviet custody in Berlin, pronounced Berlin, on April 12, 1988. This occurred after serving 10 years. He returned to Moscow, where he was debriefed by the KGB for 3 months. He was then quietly pensioned off. He never faced trial in the Soviet Union. The KGB did not want the publicity. However, he was also never celebrated as a hero. He had been caught, which meant he had failed. Volkov lived the rest of his life in a one-room apartment in Mytishchi, pronounced Mytishchi, a Moscow suburb. He worked as a translator of technical manuals. He never married. In 1994, after the Soviet Union's collapse, a Russian journalist located him and requested an interview. Volkov refused. He told the journalist at his apartment door that he had nothing to say about that time. He stated that he was someone else then. That person, he explained, no longer existed. He died in 2003 at age 66 of a heart attack. His obituary in a local Mytishchi newspaper identified him only as a retired translator. There was no mention of his years in America. Viktor Cherkashin, the Committee for State Security officer who had met Volkov at the Hot Shoppe and whose photograph had helped break the case, had a different trajectory. After his recall to Moscow in 1978, he was reprimanded for violating protocol by meeting an illegal directly. However, he was not dismissed. The Committee for State Security recognized that his mistake had been tactical, not strategic. He returned to operational work. He was eventually assigned back to the Washington Embassy in 1985. There, he would go on to recruit 2 of the most damaging spies in American history. These included Central Intelligence Agency officer Aldrich Ames and Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Robert Hansen. The irony was noted by counterintelligence historians. The man whose carelessness contributed to exposing one illegal later succeeded in recruiting 2 American traitors. These traitors operated undetected for years. Margaret Vickers followed Cherkashin's career with particular interest. After her retirement, she occasionally lectured at Federal Bureau of Investigation training seminars. She would reference the Volkov case as an example of how small mistakes cascade. She would tell audiences that Cherkashin met Volkov because Moscow was panicking about an unknown factor. That panic led to a protocol violation, surveillance, and then an arrest. Intelligence work is about exploiting the other side's anxiety. The Hot Shoppe restaurant on Duke Street closed in 1989. It was a victim of changing demographics and competition from newer chains. The building was demolished in 1991. A CVS pharmacy now occupies the site. Nobody shopping there for toothpaste or cold medicine knows this history. 40 years ago, the booth by the window was where a Soviet illegal and a KGB officer made a crucial mistake. This error unraveled 6 years of careful work. Fort Ward Park remains. The trash cans have been replaced multiple times. The jogging trails are popular with Alexandria residents. On the park's western edge, there is a historical marker. This marker is near where David Barnett or Andrei Volkov left his final dead drop signal. The marker describes the fort's Civil War history. Nothing mentions the Cold War. The apartment complex where Volkov lived, named the Fountains, still exists. Apartment number 247 has been occupied by 17 different tenants since 1978. None of them know the history. The fountain in the courtyard was repaired in 1998. It now operates from May through September. In a secure facility in suburban Virginia, the Federal Bureau of Investigation maintains a classified database. It is called the Illegal Identity Matrix. Margaret Vickers developed it in the years after the Volkov case. The database cross-references social security numbers, employment histories, birth records, and death records. It looks for anomalies that might indicate fabricated identities. It is credited with identifying 6 suspected illegals since its implementation in 1982. 4 of these were arrested. 2 were never found. The program is still operational. The search continues. The burgundy briefcase sits now in the FBI's artifact collection. It is stored in a climate-controlled warehouse in Maryland. The warehouse also holds other espionage-related evidence. The brass clasps still click with that satisfying metallic snap. Inside, preserved in archival plastic, are items discovered during Volkov's arrest. These items included the Minox camera, an onion skin note, and 3 film cartridges. The film was developed and found to contain photographs of typed reports. These reports detailed Pentagon personnel's schedules. The briefcase was identical to thousands of others sold in American department stores in the 1970s. Executives carried them. Salesmen carried them. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents carried them. It was anonymous and ubiquitous. It was the perfect object for a man who needed to blend in. In 2018, on the 40th anniversary of Volkov's arrest, a researcher contacted the FBI. The researcher was from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. They inquired about borrowing the briefcase for an exhibition on Cold War espionage. The FBI declined the request. The official response stated that the case remained referenced in ongoing counterintelligence operations. The researcher was confused. They wondered what ongoing operations a 40-year-old case could inform. However, the FBI's counterintelligence division understands what the public does not. Espionage cases are never truly closed. The illegals were trained alongside Volkov in that Moscow apartment building in 1970 and 1971. Where are they now? Some were caught and some were recalled. However, the training program graduated dozens of students. Statistically, some succeeded, some are still in place, and they learned from Volkov's mistakes. They do not keep receipts. In Moscow, in the archives of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, there exists a file. This service is the successor to the KGB's first chief directorate. The file is designated with Volkov's operational cryptonym, named Sentry. The file contains his training records and his intelligence reports from 1972 to 1978. It also contains a final assessment written in 1988 after his return to Moscow. A Department S officer wrote the assessment. The officer's name is redacted in partially declassified Russian documents released in 2015. The assessment concludes that Sentry demonstrated excellent operational discipline for an extended period. His compromise resulted from external factors, such as American Signal's intelligence capabilities. It also resulted from secondary contact protocols that created unnecessary exposure. The case study supported revision of illegal handler contact methodology. In other words, the KGB learned from this experience. They changed their procedures. They became harder to catch. The last radio transmission detected from Volkov's apartment was on June 2nd, 1978. This was the evening after his meeting with Cherkashin at the Hot Shoppe. National Security Agency analysis of that transmission, declassified in 2012, revealed its length. It was 23 seconds long, unusually extended, compared to his typical 8-second bursts. The encryption was never broken. However, signals analysis suggested the message was approximately 180 words. This was long enough to be a detailed report or a request for emergency extraction. Moscow never responded to that transmission. Either they had already decided to cut him loose, or they were waiting to assess his compromise. By the time they might have acted, he was in FBI custody. The silence must have been terrifying for Volkov in those final days before his arrest. He was sending signals into the void, waiting for instructions that never came. He realized, perhaps, that he had become expendable. This is the reality of illegal work. You are never more alone than when you need help most. On a shelf in Margaret Vickers' study in her retirement home in Charlottesville, Virginia, there sits a framed photograph. It shows the interior of the Hot Shoppe diner. Federal Bureau of Investigation Surveillance took the picture in May 1978. The photograph is slightly grainy. It was shot through a telephoto lens from across the street. You can see the counter with its chrome stools and the booths along the wall. A waitress in her uniform carries a coffee pot. In one booth, a man sits alone reading a newspaper. He is slightly out of focus in the background. It is not Volkov, but just a random customer. However, Vickers kept the photograph because it captures something essential about intelligence work. It shows the boring normalcy where betrayal hides. A diner, coffee, and receipts represent the texture of ordinary life. This ordinary life can conceal extraordinary secrets. When visitors ask about the photograph, she tells them it is from an old case. She does not explain which one. Some secrets remain protected even after classified documents are declassified. They are also protected even after the principals are dead. This is not because the information is still sensitive. It is because the work continues. Statistical analysts will tell you there are illegals living in suburbs somewhere in America right now. They have neighbors who wave good morning. They have receipts from ordinary places. They are patient, meticulous, and nearly invisible. And somewhere in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, there are analysts. They are reading reports and making connections. They are waiting for the small mistake that reveals everything. The Cold War ended. The work did not. The briefcase remains in evidence. The clasps still click. Inside, where Volkov once carried his camera, notes, and proof of purpose, there is only empty space now. However, emptiness has its own weight. It remembers what it held. That is the real secret of espionage. Nothing ever really disappears. It just waits, folded precisely, to be discovered.